many of his colleagues were very, very concerned about the justice of the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Hello and welcome to Talking Theology, the podcast of Cranmer Hall in Durham. My name is Nick Moore and I'm your host for today's episode, and our guest today is Professor Mike Snape. We're going to be talking about his work on religion and the British Army. Mike, welcome to Talking Theology, or welcome back, I should say.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to do this. Yeah.
That's great. Mike, your role here in Durham is Michael Ramsey Professor of Anglican Studies. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and that role?
Yeah, well, I'm Professor of Anglican Studies, which also is attached to a canonry at the cathedral. So I'm an ecumenical canon of Durham Cathedral. My primary role as director of the Centre for Anglican Studies, the Michael Ramsey Centre for Anglican Studies, is really to engage scholars of Anglicanism across Durham and across, the wider international academic community, basically coordinating and helping to promote their research into the Anglican tradition and the interaction of that tradition with the world in which it finds itself and the world in which it has found itself. So one of the key partners of the centre is the Anglican Communion Office. We work very closely with them. We work, of course, with yourselves at Cranmer Hall. We work with the Scott Holland Trust, and we work also with the Herbert Kelly Institute at St Anthony's Priory. So we're not identified with any integrity within Anglicanism. We are very much interested in the way in which Anglicans have related to the world, the ways in which the Anglican tradition has evolved, the way in which the Anglican tradition sees itself theologically, ecclesiologically, etc. So really we run the gamut of Anglican studies in all its kind of breadth, its diversity.
That's wonderful. Now, today we're talking about a book that you've written called Embattled Belief, Religion and the British Army from Korea to Afghanistan. It's the final part of a trilogy that covers over 300 years of history. What is it that first got you interested in the history of religion in the British Army?
Well, I suppose in common with many gestations or origins, inceptions of academic interest, if you will, it begins with family experience, family connections. My father was a national serviceman in the 1950s. My grandfather was in the First World War. They didn't talk about this ad nauseum. It was just a background detail of their lives. But growing up in the 1970s and 80s and really coming into adulthood in the 1990s, I became increasingly aware that their experience was very different from my own and from our own, insofar as we're both products of the post-Cold War generation. Issues of conflict, as it were not as immediate as they were to our grandparents' generation, even our parents' generation. And really we, I suppose, approached the 21st century and went into the 21st century, at least until 9/11, with a sense that the possibility of large-scale conflict was something that was increasingly remote. We were living in a different world order. Things seemed to be settling down in a far more favourable way than the 20th century had unfolded, for example. Now, in 2026, we look back and we think that perhaps that was a little naive, that we mistook our normality for the normality, as it were. And obviously with defence issues back on the agenda, this wasn't written against that backdrop, but in a sense the world has caught up with this particular national and indeed international concern. So I think it's just tracked my life as an adult, and certainly it's informed my academic interests. I became very much intrigued by the idea of how individuals, how institutions, particularly people of faith and church institutions, engaged with that perennial moral and experiential problem of conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And thinking specifically about this book, it focuses on the last 70 years or so. How would you characterise the potential wider significance of your work? I guess I'm thinking particularly of listeners who wouldn't immediately share knowledge or interest in the armed forces.
Well, the book begins with a survey of the dramatic nature of religious change in British society since the 1950s. And in a sense, the book is about the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, though CUP didn't want me to use the title of In the Reign of Queen Elizabeth II, so we settled on From Korea to Afghanistan. But we have seen quite tremendous shifts in the religious character of British society, the onward march of secularisation, if you want to use that term. We've seen the growth of a multi-faith society. We've seen huge changes in the values of British society, which have been characterised as being really quite puritanical and certainly decidedly Christian in the 1950s, and they certainly have changed by the 2020s. So I wanted to track the experience and development of this institution in a religious sense against that background, basically to see how far it reflects wider trends in British society, and also to what extent it bucks those trends, and also, very importantly, how religion has impinged on the operations of the army, the experience of soldiers in the British Army over that period. Because I think one of the unfortunate legacies of the secularisation of academia, if you will, over past decades, is that religion, and particularly the importance of religion in relatively recent conflicts, apart from Northern Ireland, for example, or the Balkans, has tended to be filtered out of our understanding of what drove, what coloured these conflicts, and indeed how they were experienced. So I was very keen to reintroduce religion as a concept, particularly as those developments that we've just discussed seem to be moving in an opposite direction to the direction of travel in much of the wider world, where religion, certainly towards the end of the 20th century, with the the Iranian Revolution, with the rise of the Christian right in the United States, one could go on, where basically religion was of increasing importance, not diminishing importance. So it's really also an attempt to look at the British experience within that wider global context, using the army as a kind of a case study.
And you've alluded to the vast changes in British society generally in that time frame. Could you give us a picture of what the British Army was like in 1950, when this history begins in your book, and what it's like today?
Well, I think one of the important things, one of the critical things to bear in mind is that in 1950, the army was a conscript army. It represented a much wider cross-section of British society than it does today. It was also far, far larger. I think probably 7 or 8 times the size that it is today. And one of the more revealing details that stuck in my mind from a memoir of the Korean War, that a soldier who was captured in Korea said that when you walked out of the door in the 1950s, you'd see lots of people in uniform, ranging from bus conductors to naval ratings, etc. It was just a very different society, and obviously it had recently passed through the Second World War. The First World War was well within living memory. So it was the product of a society that, in a sense, had become attuned to conflict, and in many respects, the experience of conflict had reinforced 2 things. One might say the Christian culture of British society, and this was reflected really in many respects in the persons of King George VI and, of course, his daughter Queen Elizabeth II. And the keynote which they struck of national life, a religious seriousness, was inherited to a large extent from the experience of those conflicts. But also those conflicts had reinforced a cultural Christianity within British society, particularly the Second World War. And this is manifest today, for example, in the culture of remembrance, which we've inherited, which is still sustained, which was generated to a very large extent after the First World War, which continued after the Second, which is so profoundly shaped by Christian theology, by Christian conviction, etc. So I'm only really giving indicators here, but the men, and they were men for the most part, because women were not conscripted during the era of national service, they were products of what we would call a Christendom type society, and that's one in which Christian belief and a subscription to Christian values were regarded not as an exception, but very much as the norm. And the army reflected that in terms of its human composition, but also the army as a national institution was shaped and had been shaped for generation after generation by that Christendom culture, by that assumption of Christian values and Christian beliefs. And so, in a sense, the two dovetailed into what you might call a consensus that was simply accepted. Now, if you fast forward, and obviously a lot happens between these 2 points, to the 2020s, one has seen, the accelerating, certainly around the turn of the 21st century, the accelerating secularisation of British society that had some effect on the army, but we'll come back to a very important aspect of that in a second. And also it reflected a change in values, a revolution in values, if you will, that what you might call today conservative Christian norms are no longer accepted at all by wider society. The army, to a certain extent, hung on to those values for much longer than much of civilian society. But I'd just like to make a point about the way in which the army changed in terms of its human composition. One of the striking features of the army by the beginning of the 21st century was that in many respects it resembled the human composition of a Premier League changing room, that it was increasingly internationalized, and the failure really for even a smaller army, professional army, to find the recruits that it needed in British society meant that it had to go further afield to the West Indies, Caribbean, the West and Southern Africa, and also to Fiji for many of its recruits. So what we see at the beginning of the 21st century is an internationalization of the army's composition to an extent that I think has seldom been appreciated outside of the army itself. And what that resulted in, of course, is in many respects a resurgence of Christian commitment and visibility at a grassroots level. So, I mean, in a sense, there are parts of Britain which have seen this. Many church congregations have experienced, the impact of demographic change in this way. But the army too has experienced that, and I think that's a fact that's been underappreciated in wider civilian society. So, in a nutshell, these are just aspects of what has changed between 1950 and today.
Now, one of the fascinating and perhaps surprising findings of your work, perhaps not, in light of some of what you've just said, is that the British Army has, to some extent, been immune to the secularisation that's affected the rest of British society. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting. I think immune is too strong a word. I think it's lagged behind, I think it's fair to say, the wider cultural developments in British society, religious and moral developments included. I think that there are several factors. First of all, I think that militaries tend to be conservative institutions. They're hierarchical. They rely on a strong sense of tradition. So I think there are these very broad cultural factors that help to reinforce that. But also I think it's important to bear in mind that the army of the 1950s, and this is true throughout the Cold War, was led by veterans of the Second World War. That often generals in the British Army, even in the early 1980s, would have been very young junior officers towards the end of the Second World War or in the early stages of the Korean War. And the religious importance of, or rather the importance of religion in the morale and cohesion of the British Army in both the First and the Second World War was commonly accepted. It was widely accepted by Montgomery, by Slim, by others, etc., that religion played a part on the battlefield. War Office reports said that religion and prayer had been an important sustaining factor for British soldiers on the ground during the Second World War. These aren't pious tracts written by fanciful Christian apologists. This is hardcore military writing, so to speak, or investigation. And of course, it built on a very long tradition in the West. It goes back to, well, certainly the 16th, 17th centuries, even earlier than that. This conviction that faith, piety, Christian morals made for a better type of soldier, a more reliable type of soldier, one who was more amenable to discipline, one who was more likely to be sober, one who was less likely to consort with prostitutes, etc. The whole gamut of Christian values, many of them at least, let's say, contributed to the idea of the model, the ideal soldier, and particularly the idea of self-sacrifice, a willingness to sacrifice oneself for a greater interest. This is seen as inherently rooted in Christian tradition, Christian belief. So the question of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, which is so much part of Christian faith, something again which helped to contribute to the idea of the best soldiers tend to be Christian soldiers. It kind of went with the cultural grain, so to speak. And the experiences of the two world wars, actually, rather than unseeming that conviction, tended to confirm that conviction. And that conviction, those lessons were carried over into the Cold War era and remained in place for several decades thereafter.
And do you think there are wider lessons for other institutions that might want to preserve a strong Christian or religious identity, or do you think these are factors that are unique to the army?
I'd be very hesitant to try and extrapolate to other organisations, civilian organisations. I think obviously they have a direct relevance to the other armed services. You know, had time permitted, had resource permitted, I'd have loved to have looked at the Navy and the Air Force as well, but you know, in this instance, I had to focus on the army. I think we have to accept that the armed forces and the whole concept of unlimited liability, as it were, the fact that you are actually called upon, if necessary, to incur severe injury, death, etc., as part of the job description. This does make the armed forces exceptional. And I think that it wouldn't map on, obviously, neatly to the national institutions like the NHS, or even to civilian police forces, etc. I think we have to appreciate that there is something distinctive about the armed forces, and of course that awareness gave rise in the early years of this century to the whole idea of the military covenant, which was a rather new and in many respects newfangled term, which was designed to reflect the special role of the armed forces and the particular need for civilian society to relate to them in an exceptional way. So I think that while there are some, let's say, lessons to be drawn from what has happened in terms of the role of religion in the armed forces, I think it's very hard to kind of universalize from their experience.
You talked earlier about the idea that Christians make good soldiers because the kind of virtues that Christians seek to pursue can be qualities that are useful in a soldier. Is the reverse also true? You know, the saying "there's no atheists, there are no atheists in foxholes." Is there a sense in which people who've been through conflict are perhaps more likely to be religiously awakened or sensitive?
This is a very, very interesting discussion debate, because of course we've been engaging with a cultural trope which we inherited from the war poets that many of us, certainly in the UK, studied at school, the idea that the experience of war and what you might call high intensity conflict unseams and unravels religious conviction. But I think the evidence from, let's say, statistical evidence from the US Army in the Second World War. I mean, it was odd that the US Army should have been overrun by sociologists in the Second World War, but it was, and these questions were of interest to them. Evidence from the Second World War, also evidence which I discuss in the book from Afghanistan, the British Army in Afghanistan, between 2006 and 2014. and also an increasing volume of literature from the war in Ukraine tends to illustrate the fact that while there are atheists in foxholes, it is nonetheless true to say, as the War Office pundits remarked after the Second World War, that religion can act as a consolatory and fortifying source for the individual in these high intensity combat situations. And I think that one of the most significant, very, very basic, but most significant symptoms of this is the recourse to prayer, which even one of the leading secularists in the British Army at the beginning of the century said that when he was in Iraq, and quite contrary to his own instincts, he couldn't help praying. And I think that this is where we really face one of the fundamental realities of life, that is that it's precarious, and that its course, its fate is very often outside of our control. And these observations were being made in the trenches of the First World War. They're perennial. Interesting that Methodist soldier preachers of the 1740s, who were a fantastic source, and if anybody's out there and wants to read about the British Army in the 18th century, these accounts are fantastic. And what the preachers commonly remarked on the fact that when they and their fellow soldiers were going into battle, many of them were making pledges of amendment and saying, that basically if God took them through this particular ordeal, then their life would be completely changed, to be forgotten, of course, after the danger had passed. But it's so ubiquitous. It's in a sense, it's irrefutable. The question is, to a large extent, what does one make of all of this? And I think there's a danger of making too little and dismissing it, and there is a danger of making too much. So I think it's important to be clear-eyed about what one's looking at and its long-term significance and consequence.
It is fascinating just hearing you speak both there and earlier on how blinkered we are by our own historical sort of situation and context, that those of us who've had political awareness from about 1990 to about 2020 have assumed that major global conflict is just not a thing and we're never going to face it. But actually the reality historically on the longer view, and as we now see in the mid-2020s, is actually quite different.
Yeah, and I think we have to appreciate and internalize the extent to which how exceptional the past 30 years have been. I mean, in absolute terms, for example, the British Army is smaller than it's been since the 1820s, and yet the population of Great Britain has increased by threefold over that period. So in absolute, but also in relative terms, it's a very, very, very small force. And whereas our grandparents' generation would have regarded military service as, if not quite the norm, then extremely common. Nowadays, many of us would struggle to even say they knew anybody who'd been a full-time member of the armed forces, or indeed was a serving member of the armed forces. So I think it really does help to illustrate just how marginal this constituency has become. That doesn't lessen its importance as a constituency, as contemporary national debate and discussion is illustrating. One of the sobering things, as a colleague of mine, we both know, Nick, was saying the other day over dinner that his son, who's at sixth form, he and his friends are beginning to joke about being called up. Now, this is very, very different from my experience as somebody in their late teens, and certainly I think experience most people of our generation, though granted I'm a little older than you, Nick. But I think it really does show how things have shifted in the past few years.
I guess many people, when they think about religion in relation to the army, will think about chaplaincy. And you argue in the book that chaplaincy has been reinvigorated in recent decades. Could you say a bit more about why that is and what chaplaincy looks like in the army today?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the long years of the Cold War, the long decades, when a large chunk of the British Armed Forces, and particularly the British Army, was basically in North Germany, waiting for the Warsaw Pact to pour over the border and for World War III which certainly didn't happen in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s. The role of the chaplain in that rather static, sedentary sort of operational milieu became, in many respects, somewhat ossified. The chaplain's department, which tends to prove its value when operations are in train. And this isn't true just of the Cold War period. This was true also of the Victorian period, the interwar period, etc. That the chaplain's department oddly became quite peripheral to the army and its concerns. And that change actually is a result of cultural shifts in the latter decades of the 20th century. By the mid-1990s, the army was very concerned, or senior figures within the army were very concerned that the changing values of British society, and to a large extent this was indicated by changing levels of religious identification, commitment, etc., that the old values, the Christendom-type norms which the army had always relied on, these were no longer in place, that you had to appeal to a post-Christian generation and fashion recruits in such a way that they would maintain, as it were, the ethos or something of the ethos of their predecessors without that ethos being based or predicated on religious conviction. So this led towards the turn of the 21st century to the formulation of the Army's 6 core values, which are recite as courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, and selfless commitment. Now, the people who framed these were themselves practicing Christians, but the thing is that these values were not packaged as religious values. This is important. And so, essentially, what was required of the chaplains at that point, and this served as something as a lifeline, was the chaplains department was called upon, the Army chaplains department was called upon to help inculcate these values among recruits. So there was quite a significant role given to chaplaincy just on the cusp of what became the War on Terror after 9/11, of this new educative role in instilling these values in the army at large. And there was also an attempt as a result of that to recruit more chaplains for the army. In actual fact, it seemed to be such an important role, particularly as the army was going to be involved increasingly in humanitarian operations, struggles, wars among the people, etc. Very important that soldiers behave themselves as individuals in those contexts, given what can happen. And so basically all of this was in place, and then 9/11 happened. And the revitalized nature of chaplaincy, which had basically turned on this self-examination of the army that we've just discussed, the introduction of the core values, and the remolding of chaplaincy, which was very much driven by a report called the McGill Report, which was published in 2000 about the potentialities of chaplaincy, the importance of chaplaincy in this new world order and the way the army would relate to global situations. All of this was in place, and then 9/11 happened, Iraq, Afghanistan, and this newly revitalized chaplaincy system with a new conception of chaplaincy, again, very much engaged as it always had been, at least since the First World War, with the idea of ministering to soldiers on the ground. All of this came together, and chaplaincy really enjoyed something of a renaissance during the early years of this century, certainly in the Afghan and Iraq conflicts, to emerge, with an enhanced reputation by the point at which these operations ended. And in a sense, that might seem odd because, of course, in many respects, the importance or the profile of the churches, and I have to say this is a chaplaincy system that was becoming increasingly multi-religious over this period, I must stress that. But nonetheless, religion and its place in the army seemed to be vindicated and underlined by that experience, the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, somewhat at odds with how we might regard the status or profile of organised religion, the churches in particular, in wider British society.
There is a tension in any chaplaincy, isn't there, between serving the institution, ministering to people within it, aligning with its values, but also the kind of prophetic edge. And sometimes there can be a sense in which institutions want to co-opt chaplains either for welfare or for reinforcing values. And I sense perhaps a little bit of that in that pre-9/11 work you were discussing. Is there any element of that kind of tension for army chaplains?
There is. I think one of the important things to bear in mind, and I try to underline that in the book, is that it doesn't benefit the place of religion, the influence of religion within the armed forces, within the army, and this probably applies to other institutional contexts, by having public humdingers with people in authority. That influence has to be exerted quietly and subtly behind the scenes. And this was very much the case, it appears, with the army during the Iraq and Afghanistan operations. I mean, obviously, many actors are still alive, and one doesn't want to be, too, in a sense, too forthcoming about this. But there is no doubt that chaplaincy acquired in Afghanistan, in particular, and this is detailed in the book, an important role in providing confidants for senior officers who could, very much dealing with a whole array of humanitarian and international considerations and laws, etc., operating in a very difficult environment, dealing with the pressures of losing people, enormous burdens basically being placed on their shoulders, and chaplains playing the role as guides, counsellors, etc. And I think this was really appreciated in the context of the Afghanistan operations in particular. And during the course of these discussions, there's no doubt from the evidence that I've heard and seen, that there were occasional clashes, as there had been between chaplains and senior officers in the past. For example, one chaplain general of the 1950s had a huge row with a senior officer towards the end of the Second World War, because British soldiers in Germany were doing so much looting. Now, this is obviously expunged from our popular memory of the Second World War. We don't like to see the liberators of Europe as a, host of locusts. But this sort of thing did happen, and chaplains in that context made a stand. The Chaplain General, Ivan Neal, Chaplain General in the late 50s, early 60s, said, that this was a discussion he had with the senior officer behind the scenes. This was not something to be had in a public arena, shaking your fist at authority, etc. And I think that's how chaplaincy has always worked. And sometimes critics of military chaplaincy by citing this kind of prophetic role, have assumed that it hasn't happened because we aren't afforded the great public dramas of, confrontation you might get in civilian society. But that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That this is operating behind the scenes, and there's no doubt that it helped to modulate the conduct and attitudes of senior officers during that period.
Now, by the late 20th century, the just war tradition had become embedded in the British Army. Could you summarise for us what the just war tradition in Christian thought is and what impact it's had?
Yeah, I think it's one of those areas in which we assume that the just war tradition, like, for example, the prevalence of global peace, broadly understood, that this is normative, this has always been there. But I think it's important to stress that the consciousness of the just war tradition only really became general within British Christianity, among the British churches in general, during the Cold War era. It's surprising just how long a fully articulated sense of the just war tradition took to become embedded more generally among the churches. So really, there are two aspects of the just war tradition. Jus ad bellum, justice in going to war, which is largely turned on the idea you only go to war if you have just cause, if it's a last resort, if you have proper authority, the right intention, and that the war, the suffering which the war will cause, is proportionate to the ends which it seeks to achieve. That's jus ad bellum, justice in going to war, and then there's jus in bello, how you actually conduct conflict. And this very much hinges on the principles of discrimination, i.e. discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. And also it involves another element of proportionality, the idea that you may have to injure non-combatants in going after combatants, but that's called the doctrine of double effect. But basically, the suffering of the non-combatants shouldn't be such that it outweighs any legitimate goal being achieved by going after the combatants. Now, the other dimensions, because it's an organic tradition, other dimensions have been added to the just war tradition. I think most recently, and largely as a result of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the chaos that ensued, the concept of jus post bellum has begun to enter just war discourse. The idea that you shouldn't go to war unless you've got a plan for the post-war world, and that the post-war world is manifestly a juster order than the order that you were seeking to replace. Now, so it's got many tributaries, and obviously the just war tradition has fed into international law, the law of armed conflict, etc. As I say, it's not something that was necessarily part of the mental furniture of all the British churches before the Cold War era, so one has to be conscious of that. But one of the things that certainly influenced the generation of officers who served, senior officers at this point, in the Iraq operation, Afghanistan operations, was that at Sandhurst the just war tradition was taught as part of the curriculum. Sandhurst, for those of our listeners who are not familiar, is the principal training establishment for British Army officers. And interestingly enough, the courses on the just war tradition tended to be taught by the chaplain at Sandhurst. And here I must point to the centrality of the Sandhurst chapel, the cadet chapel at Sandhurst, and of the role of the chaplain at Sandhurst, even really to the present day, in helping to form, however subtly, the mental and moral horizons of the British Army Officer Corps. That's a sideline, but it illustrates the extent to which the Army has operated until relatively recently from an assumption that religious and specifically Christian values, moral values, fundamentally shape its behaviour. And that was certainly the case and is certainly the case in terms of, training in the just war tradition at officer training establishments. One important point to bear in mind is that this had an effect, and this is quoted in the book, as a senior officer who was intimately involved in planning the British aspect of the invasion of Iraq, said in the course of an interview that many of his colleagues were very, very concerned about the justice of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, very much coloured by this training which they'd had as part of their professional training. Obviously, we're getting other influences from the media, etc., but this is not something that the army filters out by any means. So I think it's important to bear in mind that, given that the just war tradition arises out of, in the means we're discussing it, in the way we're discussing it, a specific Christian context originating with St. Augustine and then basically being evolved by Thomas Aquinas and other Christian thinkers, Grotius and others in Vittoria in subsequent centuries. The fact is that this tradition continues to inflect the British military's thinking of how it should conduct its fundamental function of armed conflict.
Yeah, and thinking about the jus in bello, justice in the actual conduct of war, what can we learn from history about the role, but also perhaps the limitations of chaplaincy in maintaining, promoting ethical conduct in warfare?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a tricky one, because I think one of the problems that we have to confront and are the limitations of chaplaincy. I don't, in any sense, try to communicate in the book that that chaplaincy is all-seeing and all-governed. Not at all. And I think that there were attempts, and there have been attempts, and they're cited in the book. For example, there are a couple of incidents. One incident in particular in Northern Ireland, where certainly we have to say this. We have to be clear. That the part of the reason why the army was very keen on promoting this new type of core values, etc., and getting chaplains on board to help educate the army in ethical terms, was that things had gone wrong in the army's operations. Things had gone wrong in Cyprus, they'd gone wrong in Northern Ireland, and Bloody Sunday, for example, illustrates just how badly things could go wrong. But nonetheless, there are instances which I cite in the book in which chaplains intervene. There was some evidence given in the to the Ballymurphy inquest, the inquest into what was known as the Ballymurphy massacre in 1971, that chaplains were trying to negotiate ceasefires between the army and the IRA at that point, etc. That chaplains were, in that sense, in Northern Ireland, seen as honest brokers. Some very, very interesting evidence emerged of the experience of chaplaincy in Northern Ireland, sometimes acting as mediators between the army and paramilitaries. So I think that's one way in which chaplaincy has helped to modulate the conduct of operations. I think also what's important to bear in mind is that the McGill report, which basically gave chaplaincy an enhanced and boosted remit at the beginning of the 21st century, made it very clear that the role of moral exemplar wasn't just down to the chaplain, it was also down to officers and non-commissioned officers, and indeed to soldiers themselves. Everybody had to buy into this. So in the sense of moderating conduct, yes, chaplaincy has played a role. Its defenders and apologists might exaggerate the role that it's played or it's capable of playing. That's one danger. The other danger is minimizing. I mean, how can you assess what hadn't happened as a result of the influence of the chaplain? And I think that in many respects, negative examples are afforded of what can happen when you remove chaplaincy effectively from the equation. If you look at the way in which the Red Army behaved in the course of its operations, or if you look at the way in which the Wehrmacht behaved in the Second World War when chaplaincy was reduced effectively to a husk, I think it's a salutary example of, well, when you remove it and you remove the moral and claims which can be exercised by religion from armed institutions, armed organizations, an awful lot can go wrong, an awful lot of terrible things can happen. So, yeah, I don't want to overclaim what chaplaincy has done. I do want to stress the limitations. I mean, because one shouldn't run away with the idea that soldiers automatically confide what they have done wrong to the chaplain, etc. In many respects, chaplains are only going to be able to act on what they're told, and they're not necessarily told everything.
Mike, final question. As a Christian, what impact has your research had on the way you view modern warfare, and what insights do you think it can give to how the church should speak and respond in a context where war is increasingly part of the global reality?
Yeah, I think that, on one level, on a personal level, I think this, looking at this kind of evidence over a period of decades, thank God I've never been exposed to these situations, is one realizes just how awful this phenomenon is, just how indescribably terrible these levels of violence can be. And I say that I'm not a pacifist, but it really, really makes me think very hard about awful things that we've seen in our own society, the sort of voyeurism that has sometimes surrounded interest in what's going on in Ukraine, the idea that people being dehumanized by watching videos of suffering on a terrible scale, an individual suffering. I think this sort of thing has been underlined by my own research. That's one aspect of it, knowing how terrible this is and just how contrary it is to God's will for us as human beings. I think it really does show the brokenness and fallenness of humanity without any doubt. The other thing that I've noticed in this, and this is in a sense more inspiring, is the fact that particularly in a society such as ours, which has been deeply coloured, I mean, Northern Ireland reflected this, the Troubles, deeply troubled by a past which turned to a large extent on religious conflict in these islands. Just how positive an experience it has been for so many clergy over the course of 2 world wars, Cold War, actually working with clergy of other traditions. You know, that this shared experience, this shared sense of service has done a huge amount of good for ecumenism at a grassroots level. And I think that's really quite striking. I remember conducting a series of interviews with 30 army chaplains who'd been in Helmand, and they all said any differences with other chaplains were always personal. They were never to do with tradition. And I think it's great that has happened. I think also that that it's shown also that in the context of even the most adverse circumstances, the work of grace, you know, that people can find faith, that faith is often sustained and confirmed in these often most appalling conditions. So I think those are 3 of the effects which studying this has had on my Christian faith.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for doing the research, for writing the book, Embattled Belief, and thank you for talking with us about it on Talking Theology.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Talking Theology, a podcast of Cranmer Hall, Durham, where we explore the best of academic theology and think creatively about how theological insights can shape Christian life, ministry, and mission in today's world. If you enjoyed this episode of Talking Theology, subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Follow us on X or Instagram at Talking Theo and share on social media. Cranmer Hall is a vibrant and diverse Christian community, forming Christ-like leaders for today's church. We offer training courses and degrees from BA to doctorate, available full-time and part-time, and we are home to students from a wide range of churches. Bursaries and scholarships are available to help with the cost of study. For details, visit our website, cranmerhall.com.